republic. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thanks. And roll call, please.
Thank you. Commissioner Kendall,
Here.
Commissioner Linehan. Here. Commissioner Pittman. Here. Thank you. Chair Sheldon.
Present.
Chris Barron.
Present.
Lisa Butler. Present. Cindy Hurst. Yes. Sherry Simmons. Here. Valerie Webb. I have not heard from. Marlo Eckert. I have not heard from. And Commissioner Page, Commissioner Martinez, and Commissioner Smith are all excused this evening.
Okay, thank you. We'll move into the consent agenda. It is a single motion, but we're going to approve the May 3rd agenda tonight's meeting for the meeting special session. And then meeting minutes of April 19, which is our first meeting. So at this time, I will make a motion.
Move to approve. Second.
Been moved and seconded to approve the consent agenda of the Royal Plains Budget Committee for May 3rd, 2023. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. Hearing none opposed, motion is carried. Thank you. So we'll move into the actual public hearing. I don't think we need to read any script for this hearing, but it is our proposal for the next biennium, which is 2023 to 2025. And with that, this time I'll turn it over to Mr. Warner and Mr. Reed.
Thank you. Here, Sheldon, I will probably pass this off to Mr. Reed. It's on. It's on. It's probably just a little low over there, but steal the better microphone. We'll have a few introductory slides, and then we'll get into the meat of some questions, and then some changes in some fund details since the prior meeting, and then just a reminder: is there a URA budget to contemplate after the city one as well? So, Bill, turn it over to you.
Okay. Oh, mine's working. Okay, very good. I'll have to swap out. Thank you, Andy. Andy's going to bring up the PowerPoint presentation for tonight's second budget committee meeting. Have some kind of just perfunctory slides to go through, remind about a few different things as we kind of dig in and pick up some things. So tonight's the second budget committee meeting for the 23-25 biennium budget process. And go ahead and
Sorry,
take care of that.
Multitasking.
Multitasking. Just kind of a quick reminder about our schedule. Tonight, May 3rd, is the second budget committee meeting. And tonight we're going to go over some response to some comments and some revisions to the budget that were made as a result of comments received, as well as just some slight edits to the budget after some just kind of after the last meeting kind of made some tweaks. So we have just a few, not many changes, but we want to present those to you because they are not in the PDF document. They've been changed since then. The PDF document that you received on April 14th. As far as moving forward, May 16th, the budget that you've been hearing fundamentally assumes that the public safety levy is passed at the election of May 16th. We had the budget, we proposed a budget that kind of plans with and around that outcome for the election. On May 24th, if on the evening of May 16th, the local option levy for public safety is not passed, we'll call a May 24th meeting to come back and discuss a budget that's been revised to reflect the levy not passing. Okay, so just to be clear, and we'll review it again at the end of this meeting. You as a budget committee can vote to approve this budget going in, assuming the levy passes. And on May 16th, if the levy does indeed, if voters approve the levy, your job is done. This goes to city council. If the levy doesn't pass on the 16th, even though you've approved this budget, we'll come back and you'll reconsider the budget and approve one reflecting the levy not passing, and then it will again go to council. So you don't have to wait until after the levy. You can approve this budget and then we can return depending upon the outcome of May 16th. So you don't have to feel like we're hanging in the balance on that for election night. You can move forward, and then levy a passage on May 16th means this committee's job is done, basically. So anyway, just to review that, and then in June, council will hold a hearing for adoption of the budget that you have approved. Based on the final approved budget. And then all of that has to be done before July, basically, so we can file with the county. And reminder, these are city council's new goals that the city council forward on everything that we do, including this budget. So just kind of a reminder of council's 3 new goals moving through to 2027. But this budget is intended to align with all 3 goals. This is just kind of a quick review of I don't want to get into the weeds. Each one of them, we've talked about them before, but these are addressed. We talked about the public safety levy, how important it is and its place here. We're planning for setting up for UGB expansion and annexation with this budget. We're working on population growth, services, inflation. All of that's meant to be addressed by this budget. We have a water rate study that's nearly done. We have a little bit to talk about specifically tonight for the water fund for that. We've adopted the ARPA programming recommendations and goals that council adopted in December with this budget. We're particularly with the library, we're working around with this budget, the county's budget problems and cuts. We'll talk a little bit more in detail tonight, but we have some compensation scale changes based on a study that was done by PSU for us in February. The new boards and commissions department is in this budget. We'll consider urban renewal in a little bit, but you've heard about that before, of course. Jesse Mays Community Center Fund and the Public Works Facility Capital Fund. We went over that the last meeting, but those were big issues to be addressed in this budget. And then capital projects we've set up for continued growth and growth expansion, and then replacement and improvement with the budget as well. So those were kind of the 11 key issues that were meant to be addressed in this budget. Okay. The local option levy for public safety, $1.65, and all of the revenues that are generated from it being earmarked specifically for public safety, the public safety department, and to assure 24/7 local patrol coverage in the community. And so in FY24, resources that would be generated by the levy would pay for dedicated North Plains based Washington County Sheriff's Office patrol deputies, the North Plains Police Department, but we contract with the Sheriff's Office. But the revenues would be earmarked to assure that there was locally based 24/7 overnight patrol, so that all calls are immediately answered. when incidents happen, rather than having to wait for wherever the closest patrol officer is outside of the city, however long or short, but however long that might take over the night hours. And from a fiscal and planning perspective, by assuring adequate resources for public safety in the general fund, we no longer have to rely on the water fund to transfer money over to the general fund to help make ends meet in the general fund. So that's one of the byproducts of the levy if it's passed, and this budget reflects that change with levy approval. Okay, so just kind of the breakdown. We've talked about this quite a bit, but the levy, if passed, we start off with adding 1.75 new patrol officer FTEs to assure 24/7 coverage year round, and ending the water fund transfer and kind of planning appropriately with the water fund for infrastructure expansion with UGB expansion. If the levy doesn't pass, again, we'll come back the Wednesday after May 16th, May 24th for a third budget committee meeting to have you look at and hear and vote on approval of a revised budget to reflect the levy not passing. We'll basically just kind of take a look at overtime continuing to be used if necessary for any kind of overnight coverage, but we won't be hiring, we won't be approving a new contract with the sheriff's office to add 1.75 FTEs for FY24. We'll have to change the PICE slices in the general fund quite a bit to reflect public safety not being funded with that levy. And then we'll be looking at the water fund renewing its role in helping to fund general fund functions. So that's if the levy doesn't pass. And again, if the levy doesn't pass, we'll come back together on May 24th. Okay, we got some questions and comments about the budget as proposed. So we just kind of wanted to go through those. A few of them have resulted in some changes to the budget that you haven't seen, and we'll show those details in a little bit. But we just kind of wanted to go through some of the questions or comments that we got. So go ahead, Andy. I'm gonna have to open my computer for this because that's really small print. This far back, sorry. Okay. We had, let's see, substantive. We had some kind of questions and comments about some trends information in the budget. The trends chapter in the budget has not yet been updated. That will be kind of how much debt do we currently have? What's the economy been like? Those kind of general trend exhibits haven't been updated, but they will be for the draft that council hears for adoption. It's just kind of background information. So let's see, we had a question about attorney's fees in what used to be the general government department. The question really was, attorney's fees were significant this past biennium. And why was that? And how are we budgeting for attorney's fees moving forward? And the response really is that we had a lot of things going on that kept attorneys busy. Fortunately and unfortunately, I guess you could say, when you have to pay attorneys for different things. But we had twice as many ordinances as we normally do, and they had to assist with things regarding that. We had litigation assistance that ended up not being cheap. That case was won, but litigation assistance costs were incurred. And then the other thing that really kind of went on is that we did a major overhaul of our personnel handbook, personnel policies, HR policies. And that required kind of a niche specialist attorney at the firm and costs accordingly. So if you add all of that up, we had unusually large attorney's fees. We have not budgeted for attorney's fees to be that high again. We're budgeting again for what is a typical normal amount each year of the biennium. But indeed, attorney's fees over the past year in particular were higher than usual, and those were the reasons. Let's see. Boards and commissions, personnel services for that department were looked high. Basically, the response to that is that the boards and commissions department personnel expense does look high, and the reason is because it's a weighted average of the staff that spend more of their time working with city council on issues, as well as boards and commissions, and that's overwhelmingly senior staff, which just happen to be more expensive staff. So that cost is a proportionally higher cost, because that's the staff typically working with boards and commissions. So that's the reason for that higher looking cost. Let's see, boards and commissions detailed expenses. What's the basis for it? The detailed expenditure table in the budget for that particular department. We just have we do have a lot of attorney's fees regarding that, professional services costs. So there's kind of a detailed breakdown. There isn't any one line item that makes everything a higher cost. But what we should say about the boards and commissions budget was that the old general government departments used to be finance, administration. It was everything that we do with boards and commissions and a few other functions. And when we kind of distilled finance and administration down into a smaller, narrower department, and we created the boards and commissions department, we kind of pulled the two apart. So it's kind of a cost split. If you recombine finance and administration department and boards and commissions, you kind of approach what the old general government cost was. So it's kind of like a split, basically. And so we did our best to budget for boards and commissions costs accordingly, kind of pulling them apart. Let's see. There was a question about library, and Robin is here to elaborate in detail, but there was a question about total personnel expenditures for the library department. 82% of total expenditures was personnel, and was that high. And so Robin has detailed statistics, but what I did want to say in response to that first was, for the library department, there were salary scale changes, and we'll get into those in a little bit, that increased personnel expenses some. And then we took a look at other cities to kind of get an idea about, is 82% of total expenses, is personnel 82% of total expense, is that unusual or high? We did take a look around, and we're kind of in the pack on that. Cornelius, for the past year or two or three, I believe, has been around 86% of their library costs. 86% of their total library costs have been personnel. Robin, what were some of the other? Well, guys, we're in there, I guess, is the bottom line. Is it on? Oh, you're good.
Yeah, we're staffing 52 open hours 6 days a week in a public facility, and so the bulk of our staff time is public facing work, doing that, and then also with the outreach and programming that we do, and maintaining the collection, so the procurement of the items and processing those and so forth. So we are just right on par with other libraries, that it is most of your costs for a public library are going to be personnel, and that's trending about the same for the past several years. It's slightly actually lower for this biennium budget because we have a transfer out to the finance department for those services, whereas that used to be in general government.
Thank you, Robin. I think we can move forward to the next one. Okay, we got comments that some line items in the Parks and Rec department did not look sufficient, and we got suggestions for bumping those line items up. So we went ahead and did that. And you'll see the new tables tonight, but the Parks and Rec department in the general fund has had some budgeted expenditures increase in 3 categories. The first one is We've added $1,500 to the budget for concerts in the park. We've added $500 to the volunteer recognition budget. And we have bumped up the North Plains Event Association expense budget to $8,500. So, but those will all be shown and captured and shown in a new Parks and Rec department table later in the slides. There was a question about a credit card convenience fee revenue that we get with the new system that we've adopted for the water utility for people paying their water bills and allowing them to do auto pay. They also can pay auto pay via credit card or come in and pay via credit card. But anytime anyone comes in and has to pay a balance of some kind, whatever kind, over $400, we charge a 5% convenience fee. And just in those instances, very rarely is that actually a water utility customer who might be overdue. $400 would mean there's a lot of overdue balance. That's actually not the most common instance. The most common instance is actually people coming in or remotely paying some kind of development fee, and they want to pay it on credit card. And we let them know there's a 5% convenience fee to that. Do you want to still pay with credit card? And they do. And so that's what that revenue is. And I don't think the Taco Bell development fees were paid via credit card, some of them. And that's part of the revenue in that line item. So anyway, that's what that is. We don't encourage people to pay that way, but that's kind of how it's worked out here and there. And so, you know, we don't see that changing really. It's just going to happen probably. Let's see, there was a comment about fuel costs, fuel expense for the water fund, and perhaps it would be appropriate to move some fuel expense over to the streets fund from the water fund, kind of based on the balance. And I guess our response was that you know, what we do see day to day is a surprising number of miles covered by employees dealing with water customer issues. Or you know, whether it's off taking a look at something, verifying a repair, verifying somebody's cleared a tree or a shrub in front of a meter, going and doing door hangers to warn of water shutoffs, that sort of thing. You know, employees out and about do end up spending a lot of time and miles and gas doing water fund functions. So our response was, we're open to moving fuel expense around, but it is true that water fund day-to-day stuff does incur a surprising amount of driving, and that's all that budget was meant to reflect, or that budget item. So, but that was kind of what we wanted to express regarding that. We actually at the last budget meeting and in our comments, we got very good comments about the Jessie Mays Community Center Fund and its assumptions. And, you know, we just want to agree with a person who commented, this is a first try at trying to put together a budget, and it's not an easy thing. But we just kind of wanted to go over a few things. One of the comments was, residents should be charged less than non-residents. That's the current policy now, and the fund and its setup and assumptions that will continue to do that. If residents want to utilize the building, if residents want to utilize the new covered area for a birthday party, that sort of thing, they'll pay less than somebody who's not a resident. We'll continue that. We have no intention to change that, I guess is what I meant to say. Council adopts and approves those policies, but we have no intention of recommending any changes to that, is the bottom line. What we do recommend though, is probably kind of the biggest point or question made about the Jessie Mays Fund as it was drafted. Were the revenues assumed to be coming in over the biennium? And it was observed that the assumed revenues were probably high. They may very well be. I don't, I think it was $40-something thousand is what we kind of came to after some work. That may very well be. And what we want to reiterate is that our intent isn't to have just the Jesse Mays, have Jesse Mays be a profit center per se, in terms of rentals. But what I will say is that finance staff actually kind of went and did a pretty elaborate review of what other historical properties in other communities, if they're rented out, what are they rented for? What are the terms of rental? You know, kind of did a big comparable analysis, for lack of a better word, just to get an idea of how could we think about Jesse Mays being utilized? What are we renting versus what are others renting theirs at? What do they offer that we do or don't? That sort of thing. And we'd be more than happy to kind of come and talk to council, have a work session and kind of discuss what we found and what we are recommending, kind of based on what we found and maybe what the direction could be for some of this. Ultimately, the goal of all of this was, can we get to a point where we're building some reserves for replacement and repairs? That's all. Like we have no idea at this point. We haven't had a plan for it, and we don't have an idea of what revenues might be for rentals and how that reimburses us for the cost of managing the rental process. So we just wanted to put something together, at least as a starting point. What we did find, and we can, maybe a work session would be appropriate to kind of talk about all this a bit more. What we did find was that most other facilities in other communities, smaller communities, that kind of had a historical nature to them for community rental. Rental fees were typically 3 and sometimes 4 times as high. So this budget assumes that we don't go that high with fees, but we do increase them over the biennium by about 100%. We double them to kind of move in that direction and see what we can do about covering costs. The kitchen and other features of the building aren't comparable to other places that do rent much higher because they just aren't the same facilities. So we wouldn't begin to assume we could charge that much or that we would want to charge that much. But that's the basis for that revenue assumption. The other thing that we haven't modeled into revenue or income assumption is the covered area. That's probably the covered areas next to playgrounds are probably the busiest on the weekends. Rental opportunity at other parks and other communities. And that's something that can be $20-25 an hour or whatever. It's pretty cheap, but we haven't fully programmed that into potential revenue in the budget. So either way, that's the basis really for the revenue assumptions in the budget. And it's up to council to adopt a fee schedule and be comfortable with a fee schedule. But as far as for budgeting purposes, that's what's in the numbers. That was kind of the initial take on it. To at least move in a direction of some kind of accounting for it. But council and community sensibility about this building and its use and revenue that's generated, that's council's decision, but we just wanted to put this forward. So that's the basis for it. Next slide. We're good to keep rising. I'm going to keep moving my. Okay. We had a few questions about. I have 2 questions. The Public Works Building Fund. The biggest piece of funding for that facility, new construction, will be a reimbursement grant that we got from the state of Oregon, and that's $5 million. But the city's skin in on that, the city's share will be system development charge transfers from the transportation SDC fund, the water SDC fund, and the Parks Capital Fund, which is basically the Parks SDC accounting fund. And the question was, is the amount that we're planning to transfer from the water SDC fund and from the Parks Capital Fund, 1.46 million and 140,000 respectively. Are those numbers enough? And the answer to that question philosophically is maybe not. we don't have the final costs of the facility nailed down yet. The numbers that are in the budget, the 1.46 million for the water SDC fund to transfer over, and the 140,000 from the Parks Capital Fund to transfer over, are based purely on what was calculated in the SDC methodology update report from last spring. That report identified the facility as a capital project in the capital improvement plan, and then it calculated in detail what share of that building is actually new capacity need versus meeting the need of existing capacity. And SDCs legally have to basically be not for replacement, or these SDCs can't be used for replacement or operations, but they can be used for and are supposed to be used for expansion of capacity need in facilities. And so the numbers in the budget reflect what the study said we could do. Now, having said that, we've had more growth than, perhaps than was projected in a year or two. And what we'll say is that for now, we'll have those numbers as kind of the placeholder for what the document says we can do, but we can reach out to the consultant and ask them to take another look, and if there's any ability to put more SDC dollars into the public works building, kind of based on their review of things, then we're more than happy to do that. Okay, let's see. Total vehicle reserve transfer. The vehicle reserve fund, different departments that require vehicles on an annual basis will sock money away, a certain amount from their department or their operating fund, streets, water, library, finance and administration. But different departments and funds will save money on an annual basis and put it into, some of their saved money, plenty is saved, but some of the money that's saved is actually transferred specifically to the vehicle reserve fund in order to save for future vehicle need. And the comment was made that the amount that was being saved on an annual basis was not enough, because as the city grows, more different sophisticated vehicles will be needed. We don't disagree. So what we did was just what we've done, and you'll see the new numbers in a little bit. We've bumped up. Really the funds, the departments that use vehicles and will, see that need are streets and water. So basically what we did is we bumped up the vehicle reserve fund savings that each of those two funds do and put over into vehicle reserve fund for replacement. So that is pretty close to $100,000 annually now in total. So we made that change, and so you'll see the exhibit in a little bit. Okay, we had a few comments about what the proposed salary scales are, what the proposed COLA is, and step adjustments are. And so what we wanted to do is, in the next slide, I kind of have an exhibit, but what we wanted to kind of do is talk about this budget does indeed propose some changes to pay scales for a number of different jobs in the city. Last late fall, early winter, we retained Portland State University to do the first update, kind of salary scale comparison study that's been done in a few years. I can't remember offhand how many years it's been. 2018. Thank you, Lori. 2018 was the last time the city had done a salary study. This time around, we asked Portland State to do, it's a salary study, but we asked them to do what's called a whole compensation study. And given that council approved and adopted a new personal time off system last year, a new PTO system, we asked Portland State to take a look at base salaries in the context of total benefits, including the PTO system. Because the idea was, if we have a better PTO system, we may or may not have to pay quite as much in base salary because of the new PTO system. So the idea is, where do salaries stack up in the context of all benefits paid out? So that's what we had Portland State do. They finished that up February-ish. And so based on what they found, and you can go ahead and, if you don't mind, go on the next slide. Okay, here's where we get into the charts, or chart. So based on what they did, what they found, or at least, they looked at 8 or 9 other communities.
8 cities,
Eight
1 county.
8 cities, 1 county. That's it. That's why the number 9. So 8 cities in Washington County, but the 8 cities were a mix of Washington County cities that are nearby, and then some semi-rural communities that have been going through a lot of growth over the last few years, kind of like us, but not necessarily in Washington County. So that included Estacada, that included Scappoose up in Columbia County, and that also included Sisters.
Sandy.
Oh, and Sandy, yeah, sorry, and Sandy over in Multnomah County. But Sisters, I can't remember if Sisters is in Deschutes or Jefferson, but either way, you know where Sisters is. It's certainly not in the Valley or Washington County for that matter. So what the report and all the kind of detailed tables identified was that many of North Plains' salary scales were on average about 7 to 10% below competitive. And I put quotation marks on competitive. What is competitive for North Plains? North Plains kind of has this balance between 2 kind of competing things going on. Number one, it's a very small city. It's growing, but it's a very small city. So I, as a finance director in North Plains, I don't have the same job as the finance director in Hillsborough or Beaverton. They're doing organizational management. I'm looking at the actual numbers all day for different accounts and querying things and then doing fiscal planning, that sort of thing, but they're not the same job. So I, as a finance director, should not be paid on the same salary scale as the Hillsborough finance director or Beaverton finance director, that sort of thing. Our jobs at a smaller community are different. And the ability to pay salary for those jobs is different. But at the same time, and as we found in trying to hire a public works director and in nearly hiring a planning manager and that falling through and losing to Scappoose and having to take more time to find who we did for planning manager, we're in the Washington County job shed. And a lot of our employees, including me, live in Hillsborough and places, well, here is even getting to be expensive to live based on the price of homes. But we're in Washington County. And so we kind of have the reality of being a small town, having jobs that should pay appropriately for that, but being a small town on the cusp in Washington County. So it's kind of a balance. So the result is, what we identified was we want to try to target salary scales for North Plains that are on par with semi-rural growing communities. And the most comparable one out there based on the numbers was Estacada. It's at a population of around 5,000 now. It's in Clackamas County and it's very rapidly growing, not inside the Portland Metro UGB. It's kind of a very similar situation. So our targeted pay scale on average, the dark blue one, second lowest there. We wanted to target pay scales that were reasonably comparable to that, but perhaps a little bit higher, not much, but a little bit higher to reflect that we have to attract talent in Washington County. And that's kind of the reality of being in Washington County. So overall, the average kind of pay scale proposed in this budget reflects being slightly above Estacada, slightly below the 8-city average among all the cities considered, and really in the lower quartile of Washington County cities that we looked at. Hillsborough is a crazy outlier, and we kind of threw them out and really threw them out. Yeah, I mean, there's just no way. So what it kind of boiled down to was taking a look at what Cornelius pays, what Scappoose pays, what Forest Grove pays, and frankly, trying to land below them, but not being too far below, because again, we kind of, for some things, we kind of compete against them for different jobs, not all, but some. Andy, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, it had been 5 years since we'd done a comp study in North Plains. The county and the city has changed a lot in that time. And I think Bill said it right. A lot of this was kind of art and science. The art portion is from a red face test. Where do we think we should be? Can we aim a little higher than, certain Washington County neighbors? We wanted to try to do that because this is where we think North Plains should be positioned. Are we expected to be below others just because of their, they're bigger or their financial means? Yeah. So that was sort of the art, and the science is the modeling we did based on the study. So like Bill said, we put in all the data, including the PTO, and then we saw where we landed, and then we backed out our own PTO system, and that gives the raw wage. Because in some areas, some of the PTO benefits in some sense make us look a little bit more attractive. So we back all of that out, and then the raw wage is what you get here. Some of these were surprising from other cities, and but that's but there's some areas, I don't mind saying that, even though they're sitting here, and directors need to be. I'd like to retain people, and so we needed to bump up some of these areas. And then we intentionally show some cities too, like Scappoose, that maybe are a bit further away, but we wanted to look at those that maybe would be in the travel shed of people driving 40-45 minutes to North Plains. We want to kind of compare those two because that's going to be the reality of what we're looking at. So yeah, that's where things landed. And the blue right there is kind of where the proposed scales are from the median average for across all positions.
I want to see this. I'm not arguing that we don't want to be competitive, and that was my comment. That I want to make sure that our personnel costs don't get run away. Because when I look at state pay scales, they're probably underperforming. I'm still not settled that, okay, we're where we're at. I understand there could be some issues with hiring, and it's been tough out there. Depends on who you're hiring and what you're hiring. I understand that. I want to make sure that we're controlling our personnel costs, because I still think compared to maybe not to Hillsborough or Scappoose, I want to make sure that we're being prudent and fiscally responsible with that arrangement.
Yes, of course. You'll get no disagreement there. Yes, we'll happy to share that study with you or whoever wants to see it. Yeah, but this is us trying to stay competitive and stay ahead of things too. People in the public sector, they get in the PERS system. That's a portable pension plan, and people jumping from city to city is very common. So we're at least try to be on par and benchmark ourselves where we're not quite the stepping stone. That was the attempt here, without getting, too big of a britches either, I guess.
Well, yeah, when I look at the range, I have no idea where we're at in those ranges. I know what the ranges are, and they could fall in there anywhere. But I don't know in terms of the study and the ranges and where we're actually at. To me, there's just no basis. I can't find anything really in my mind settles me to the point where, okay, we're competitive, we're not paying too much, and we're not paying too little. And that encompasses a total compensation perspective, not just the hourly rate or the salary. That's what I'm at. Is okay. I just, I have to see more, I guess, to feel better about that.
Yep, happy to share the tables in that report.
Okay.
Are there any other comments or questions? No, I keep going.
was gonna say, no one comment, looking at the high range of this, knowing what the median household income is in North Plains, and you're proposing a high range adjustment on these, that median household income. So it's not like we're gonna, city officials rich, it's very much, hey, this is the median household for North Plains, and we should pay our city manager, directors, at least the median for the household income, to the city of North Plains.
Yes, part of this is just being in the fact that we're in Washington County. And it's probably the most lucrative county in the state.
Most
Yeah.
lucrative county in this entire state. So it makes it difficult for us to compete in that environment. When you look at it across the entire spread, I understand where you're coming from. I just want to look at the total compensation, which includes the contribution we make, which includes the total burden of the ETO. All of those things impact our budget. And they aren't exactly, I'm not sure I can see in the monetary matter exactly how that's doing it and where we're at. That's all I'm interested in. I am not interested in underpaying our people, but I certainly don't want to overpay when we don't need to do that. So any additional questions?
Okay, so two last questions or comments that we got that are kind of related, a little more specifically, but not to pay scale. The first one was about the COLA increases that are proposed in the budget, and the question was in terms of what the recommended COLA cost of living adjustments were during the biennium. Is that ultimately a council decision and adoption? And the answer is yes. Ultimately, yes, council would, this committee recommends approval of the budget that would include the proposed cost of living adjustment, but ultimately, when council hears the budget for actual adoption, what council lands on as a policy might be a little bit different for adoption, but ultimately, yes, that's up to council to adopt and make the decision on. And then the second question was regarding the step increases. So unlike the cost of living adjustment that gets proposed each year, just to kind of overall account for some kind of inflation, each year, if at employee review time, if the employee has earned it based on their annual evaluation, then they can qualify for a potential step increase, which would be a different enhancement to their pay and a different pay raise. And that's a different rate than the COLA, which would be implemented on July 1 at the beginning. The COLA typically, whatever COLA is approved gets implemented on July 1 of that year for everybody. And then the step increase, which is the subject of the step increase rate, which is the subject of the second question, that the step increase rate, like the COLA, gets heard and decided and adopted by council. But there is discretion within that by management whether or not to give that step increase. So it does work differently. The COLA gets whatever COLA gets approved by council, that gets implemented and adopted by council in June, that gets implemented July 1 for everybody, all employees. But the step increase, the rate gets approved by council with budget adoption, but whether or not an employee gets that step increase is up to the result of their evaluation, basically. And those were all the comments and questions that we had received. A few of them did result in budget changes, so that's the next few slides.
There was one question. There was one question I'm not sure that I've heard the answer before. If you go back to the very beginning of the student. I think it was 25.
Let me go back to a version I can see. Oops. Number 5. So, yeah, so the answer to that one, so that question was, I mean, literally was, is that are expenses for the boards and commissions department a swag? And I guess the answer is, my attempt at an answer was no. The budget for boards and commissions expenditures is based on past expenditures that used to be in the general government department. So it is based on past expenditures, the budget is. But the comment was actually made on the summary page. In the budget, there's a summary spreadsheet for every department in the general fund, and it shows all the different revenues and then a summary of the expenditure categories. And then following that table, there's a detailed expenditure table that itemizes all of the expenditures by category for that department. And so I wasn't sure if the comment made had yet seen the detailed expenditure information in the table that followed, because the comment was made about the summary, the first table, the summary table. But for boards and commissions specifically, those items in the budget for that new department are based on what we had been spending on different things in the old broader general government department. So it's kind of based on past expenditures.
Believe that might have been my question. And yes, I think I made the comment on the summary page. After looking at the detail of expenses, I still wasn't sure, attributions at the rates and how those were made. That's a difficult thing to do when you're basically adding a new line item.
Yeah, Councilor Sheldon, that's correct. I mean, most of the line items for the boards and committees, most of the line items for the boards and committees departments really kind of are based on what general government had been spending on them, and then assuming some sort of split based on, well, we know this vendor and these invoices were for this, but we know these are for more purely finance administration things. So there was an attempt, like I said, there was an attempt to split general government, the bigger general government department, into pull it apart and split it in two, basically. So, so we have a track record of expenditures for different line items and know how we can split that. But for some, we kind of had to figure out, what to budget for. There's a bump to things like training and education that we haven't been doing in the past, that we've budgeted for council and other boards to be able to do, go to, conferences and trainings, that sort of thing, that we haven't done quite as much in the past. So that was kind of a new attempt at budgeting for it. But for a lot of the line items, it was really kind of what had we been spending in the past in the bigger department and pulling that out. If that makes sense, if I describe that, it makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm going to be very interested in what the actual number will be as we cruise through the next 2-year period, and then I'll be interested to go back and compare that with the assumptions that we're making. That's all I was after, is how we will see those numbers. Not that it was a gigantic pull it out of thin air. They have more to do with, okay, how accurate will they have more.
Yeah. Should put that to.
So we have other questions that we should ask for other questions here or online. I'm assuming, unless you want to jump into something else.
Councilor Sheldon, at this point, we have we have one department and 3 funds that have modifications since the budget that you saw in print, in PDF and reviewed. And they aren't big changes. And we can zip through these pretty quickly, because most of them really have to do with the response to comments that we got. We talked about them already a little bit. Okay, there's really only one, the water fund that, you know, a little bit of conversation, but city council's heard about this already. So there's not a ton new here. So if there are more questions, that would be the time, I guess I would say.
Afterwards,
That too, that also.
I mean, is there any reservations, questions, or anything at this point that we go forward, or address some of the questions that they come up on that? We're gonna have time for questions, so maybe we're gonna go ahead, let's see the effects on these, and then we can go from there. How's that?
Sure, no problem. Okay, Parks and Rec Department. So, like we mentioned, we got some comments that some events, some line items didn't look like budget was sufficient based on what had been happening recently. So we bumped up the budgets for these three line items, expenditures for these three line items accordingly. Concerts in the Park was increased by $1,500 in the budget. Volunteer recognition was increased by 500, and the expense line item for payment to North Plains Events Association for basically doing events activities for the city in partnership with them. That budget was increased to $8,500, and those weren't really big changes. So the net effect on the department is maybe $3,500 more in expenses, roughly. Didn't have much of a change to the ending department balance, the projected ending balance at the end of the biennium for that department. So anyway, those are changes that aren't in the PDF version that you saw initially. Okay, Streets Fund. The change there is in response to comments that we received and talked about a little while ago, and that is that the comment was made that both the Streets Fund and the Water Fund are going to be dealing with expansion and growth and likely more and different vehicle need in the future. And so the recommendation was to bring total vehicle reserves contributions each year up to $100,000. So proportionately, the Streets Fund, we bumped up its annual contribution to the Vehicle Reserve Fund by $30,000 more than the budget that you saw, that's in PDF that we sent to you on April 14th. So that expenditure line item transfers out to Vehicle Reserve Funds. Now on this sheet right here on the slide is 30,000 more annually, and so therefore 60,000 more of a transfer across the 2-year biennium to the Vehicle Reserve Fund. And those aren't small numbers, but at the same time, the ending reserve balance for the Streets Fund was significant before this change, and the $60,000 additional transfer to Vehicle Reserve Fund brings that down, but doesn't threaten any sort of reserve retention issue at all. The fund can afford that transfer is the bottom line. And then the Water Fund. Okay, this is a little more complicated and worth a little bit of conversation. We might get some questions about it. So we're winding down a water rate update study. Water rates haven't been updated and changed in a number of years. And so we have that study going on, and we have the local option levy before voters. And the way the city has been financed with the property tax rate that it has, the Water Fund, as we've talked about before in previous budgeting processes, the Water Fund has been transferring money over to the general fund to help make ends meet, basically, to fund different things. With the levy passing, assuming the levy passes, the Water Fund doesn't have to transfer money over the way it was transferring. And after working with the consultant on ultimately what that means for the Water Fund, we basically determined that if we want, we can budget for the Water Fund to reduce residential base rates by 10% in FY24. without there being any kind of negative impact on the fund's ability to help pay for infrastructure expansion for UGB expansion in about 2 years. And so these new budget numbers here reflect a 10% decrease in residential based water rates in FY24 as kind of like a reset. If the levy passes, we would propose dropping residential base rates by 10% in FY24, and then begin to, and as the study recommends, the water rate update study recommends, begin to index water rates increasing by an inflation factor beginning in FY25. So 2.5%, 3%, whatever the inflation indexed inflation rate is. But for FY24, July 1 this year, this budgeting proposal would be to cut residential base rates by 10%. Again, if the levy passes. And there's the second page. And there's a second page having to do with the vehicle reserve fund. The water fund would be contributing additional savings to the vehicle reserve fund to meet that $100,000 savings goal every year that was suggested in comments. And the water fund can afford to do that. So the numbers have been changed to reflect that accordingly in this budget right here. For the water fund. So the water fund's been changed to reflect 10% residential base rate cut in FY24, and then contribute more to the vehicle reserve fund. Very specifically, if we cut residential base rates in FY24, that would mean this budget has $175,000 less revenue in FY24. That's the impact. In FY25, with base residential water rates being indexed to inflation and going up the first time in FY25, we're around $150,000 less revenue in FY25 because of that reset, but plus inflation. So that's the net impact on revenues. And ultimately, the goal is we don't know ultimately the total bill on infrastructure expansion for the UGB or when. But the attempt here is to make adjustments to the water fund so that it can still be a significant contributor to borrowing capacity for infrastructure expansion. So that's basically what we're trying to plan for. Any questions about that?
I do have a question. I hope this is something someone needs to ask, and I must go. Are there other precedents or other cities that do this, that use their water fund to subsidize the budget?
Lisa, that's a great question. It's common. It's common in more rural areas. As a matter of fact, the former city manager that we chat with, and just kind of about city growth and how the city can needs to provide services, that sort of thing. And he used to be a client of mine and was a consultant. City of Independence, very specifically, significantly did that. And they're not the only ones doing that. Particularly where there's long been slow economic growth, and employment growth and business investment growth has been slow or non-existent. Water revenues kind of end up being the engine, the fiscal engine for the city over time. And the other reason is because of Measure 50. Water rates, you try to, if you plan your water utility for replacement and taking care of service need, you'll typically at least index water rates to inflation over time, just for cost issues. And more potentially, if you have to, you can set water rates to be higher than inflation if you have big capital projects coming up. Council has discretion to do that. But Measure 50 in property tax rates, it's state law. Your tax bill can't go up by more than 3%, no matter how desperate a city is to do a project or something that would be property tax funded. Measure 50 state law permanently caps your tax bill from going up more than 3% annually. So cities end up leaning on water funds on the water utility to help pay for certain things. Or, yeah, as Andy had mentioned, or have a local option tax. So Indy has one, and I'm not sure what the rate is, and most other cities around here do. So it's kind of a combination.
That, it is a good question. And when Bill started as finance director, one of my things I said to him was just rip this whole thing apart so we can build it back up and really start seeing where costs are going. And this is an attempt to try to right size these things where our water fund is paying for water, water capacity, water projects. As he said here, this is basically our only source to do any revenue bonding, to be a water fund. So let's stick to doing that and not transferring to the general fund. And that's where, but 217 property tax is where we are. And that, that was a Measure 50 legacy too. Everyone's rate was frozen then. So if you're in Gaston, it's the $6 property tax rate. In North Plains, it's 217, but it's, cities often look at other ways to supplement that. So this would be a way to, I guess, reset the water fund if we have the ability to do that.
I mean, now or in the future?
As in, if it's all dependent on new revenue, supplemental revenue from the local option tax, as in this July, FY24.
And just to clarify, but it looks like we're still going to go, even with the levy passing, we're still going to use some of that to subsidize everything. Right,
The water fund?
Just wanted to clarify.
Well, only things that would be appropriate to water. So, vehicle fees and things like that. Well, yeah, those are vehicles that are serving the water department, transfers, related to that, but it's, 99% going to be sticking to water functions.
With one last fund with changes. The vehicle equipment reserve fund. We covered earlier, we're having the streets fund and water fund save more money for future vehicles. And so the vehicle and equipment reserve fund its transfers in revenues has been bumped up accordingly to reflect that change in the other funds, the transfer from the other funds. And that's the change in that fund, just to be complete. And that is it for comments so far, responses to those comments, and then any number changes in fund or department budgets so far. So Councilor Sheldon, now it's definitely, if you're ready for more questions, yeah.
So we'll just probably start there with Chris. Chris, do you have any questions before we go? No questions.
One question that I have is the personnel study is done previously. So based on Rosa's comments, the city council has not seen that study.
Right. That's an
Okay.
administrative survey to see where we wanted to benchmark in our budgeting.
Well, okay. I understand that, but also since the city council hasn't seen that study and made adjustments here, I assume that the city council will be looking at all of that before they do a final budget approval.
Yes, as I said earlier, we'll share that. And then the council would ultimately be taking up any budget in June.
Okay, all right, that's the only question. Thank you.
Mr. Taylor.
Hi. Bill, the water, the funds of the water department, are they being used, all those funds being used for this budget? Did we have a reserve fund in the water fund over the years? I haven't seen that lately, but I know there was I thought I saw a $4 million pot of money. Am I correct in that? I'm just curious, I don't see it heading on paper, so I'm just curious if we're using all the water funds to make the budget work? Or are we have reserve above the what we're trying to do?
Council Kendall, we have a reserve for the water fund and still do. And I guess I would, where I would point is that it's the ending reserve for the water fund is the very bottom line in bold for the water fund. Oh, thank you, Andy. He's got a plan. So at the end of this fiscal year, June 30th, based on everything that's been done, since July 1, 2021, we're expecting the ending balance, the ending reserve for the water fund to be almost 3.1 million.
Say it again, please.
Almost 3.1 million. 3.076 million will be the unspent reserves for the water fund. In this budget for the water fund, in 2 years' time, June 30th, 2025, this budget expenditures and revenues, the projected ending reserves are $3.7 million.
Okay, so help me out, is that a plus or minus? How much? I mean, $500,000?
We're looking to add roughly $500,000, closer to 6 for the water fund.
Okay, that's good. So it's a big difference, in the city, over property taxes by what?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
That's a good thing. I see that with you. Here's a thought, I'm just gonna throw this at you, I'm not needing much, but we have that well sitting down there, I thought, well, we could ever clear that up. Or could we put 30 or 40,000 gallons a day in the reservoir and have that for a source of income, a little bit buffer, or maybe another well down the road, because we're buying it and we're making money. Apparently, I don't know what the cost is for buying water and selling it, and those things, but just a thought, but I feel like, public works, talking about that. I don't know why we couldn't do something like that.
Thank you, Councilor Kendall. I guess what I would say is, starting in July, we're going to start a UGB expansion, kind of more formal planning process. And part of that will be the beginning of planning infrastructure expansion for not only the homes that are going to be added over the next 20 years, but kind of more on point with your comment, we're going to be looking at planning for water expansion, water capacity expansion to meet the needs of both the employers we're planning for as well as the homes. And so whatever the menu ends up being of what we have to do to bring that water capacity expansion, it may include additional reservoir, it may include underground storage, it will have to include in some way bigger pipe bringing more water into town. Some of the industries that we're planning for and are already expressing interest in being here are going to require us to have a bigger pipe coming into town with more water.
I don't want to make this, the thought stuff go on, but I think that one measure that I was saying the other night, I think it's a question that I still want to talk to him about future of the city and the water coming into it and what we're going to sell. So, we put a lot of fun. At your point.
I just have a question. How do you
I have that info, that's actually later in the report. I'm trying to remember offhand how many, have we added one? Yeah, I'll send it to you. Well, so if the levy passes, there would be the 1.75 deputies, yes, which technically wouldn't be our employees because it's a contract. So what I was thinking of and trying to look up was how many city staff, city employed FTEs. And I think it might, I'll look up the specific number, but it might be one, maybe. I don't recall that we have a budget for much staff expansion.
In 2 years, yeah.
And my.
Sure.
All right. This-
Oh, Counselor Pavin, the question
Go ahead.
was how many employees were we planning for over the biennium? And the answer is probably 1.5. I think it's across all departments.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Lisa.
Well, I asked my question about the water, and this is from the PPP stuff, the follow on to this water. So yes, you're planning on this reserve for us to build out. We're planning out this reserve for infrastructure. Is there a plan down the road for some of these industries that we can depend on to be the ones that are subsidizing rather than us?
So just in case that was softly heard online, it's okay, so the microphone might lose microphone, so sometimes don't necessarily pick it up. The question was, is there a plan or will there be a plan for the cities? I'm going to rephrase it a little bit and let me know if I'm incorrect. Will there be a plan, or is there a plan for the city's financing of water and other infrastructure so that it is the employers paying their burden rather than the city paying or subsidizing the burden? There isn't a plan yet. But that conversation and thought process has already begun. So the start of that really was a few weeks ago. City Council had a work session with Business Oregon staff. They appeared on Zoom to kind of talk about infrastructure expansion and planning and needs for some of these employers and how the state works with cities or how cities need to think about that. And it's a bit different from infrastructure expansion for residential and who pays when and how money is recovered. Business Oregon will partner with us on water connections for homes, but for employers and water capacity, for instance, they will. So there's just different equations and different ways of doing it. But I guess what I would say is that similar to the answer I gave, or the comment I gave to Councilor Kendall a little while ago, kind of the more formal beginning of planning of infrastructure, particularly water, for UGB expansion and growth. We'll be working on the beginning of an infrastructure finance plan. And frankly, the city can't afford, unlike Hillsborough, we can't afford to put a whole bunch of money out there and A, subsidize, or B, put a ton of money out to make it work and then hope to recapture that money. We just can't afford it. The water fund budget that you saw a little while ago, that base water rate discount for residences in town, that'll still allows us to conservatively be able to borrow $6.5 million in a couple of years for water infrastructure. That sounds like a lot of money, but the reality is, it's a helpful contribution, but it's part of the equation and certainly not a majority of it. So our planning will have to be done with utility partners on figuring out what the city can even afford to pay for and in a fair manner. Because some things, infrastructure needs to be put in place ahead of time for the business to consider moving to North Plains. And in other instances, that doesn't have to be the case. Different employers look at it differently. And so all of that has to go into the planning that begins really in earnest in July.
Yeah, thank you very much, Council President Sheldon. I have two questions, one for Robin and one for Bill. And Bill, I'll start with Robin, so you can see your vocal cords rest for a moment. And Robert, it's been a few years since we talked about this, so you can also help me refresh my memory. I'm looking at the pool two piece on your budget, and I just, I know that the CCLS has their own, issues that they're working with, and I think you mentioned in the past that we are really not expecting any pool two.
Pool two used to be, when more revenue than expected came in for the levy, and they're expecting a 1% decrease in assessed value for next fiscal year, so, and the current IGA doesn't even have pool two in it anymore, because they're looking at a new formula to allocate funds to member libraries. Just putting everything on the table and doing a study with the executive board.
Yeah, and so on the budget, it says it's restricted. And then there was some carryover. So can you just remind me what that means, please?
Sure, all of the funds we are allocated from WCCLS is restricted to be used for operational costs only.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And then, Bill, this is probably a pretty easy question, but on page 24, just looking at general fund unrestricted funding down. And actually, it's kind of a beautiful document, and you have your year-end estimates, right? And then obviously your proposal for 2025. So I guess in my mind, my question is just like, do you account for sort of like a plus or minus number when you anticipate those year estimates? I know that the books won't, we're still in the fiscal, in the biennium, and that won't close until after, which is fine. But in my mind, I'm just kind of wondering, do you account like a plus or minus on these numbers here? It's not a perfect science.
Yeah.
I understand, but generally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, I every month I track trailing and property tax revenues. Some of our franchise fees come in quarterly, some come in monthly. I mean, as far as unrestricted revenues, we have a better idea about where things will land. But I still tend to kind of back things off by at least 3%. Just, I don't mind being wrong on the, things come in higher. But our unrestricted revenues overwhelmingly are pretty scheduled and easy to track. So we've not had a lot of problem with unrestricted revenue estimates and forecasting to be too far off. Because we get reports in advance from the county on it. Year's assessed value is going to be so, I like making it look like a great forecast.
Question for Robert. I know recently that you received the LTC grant. Is that factored into this?
It isn't, we can't publicly announce that yet, but I did, it's okay. We should send out a press release at this time or something, because they would like to announce all the winners together, but they said it was okay to share with boards and commissions.
Okay.
But
Will that be something that goes into the next thing? No. Or do you know?
well,
When do you see it?
it would, the funds will be received. I think by the end of this month.
So I guess what, yeah, I guess what it would be carryover, and we can modify, even though we don't still know the full specifics of it for modifying the numbers here. We can have those changes in to what council sees for adoption. So it's, you can, the budget committee can vote to approve this budget, not knowing those full details, but then we come back later to council, knowing more about that specific issue.
I might be wrong about this month, I had a meeting about it today, but that wouldn't make very much sense because of fiscal years, so, but the funds are released within the next few months. We have about a year to spend.
Thank you, Robin. Bill?
Okay, do we have any questions from anybody online?
No questions for me. Thank you.
Krista? Any additional questions for the budget committee? So, that being the case, we have the opportunity to get some additional information. We have the opportunity to not table it, consider a motion to recommend the budget as it's been amended to council, and that would be contingent upon the levy passing on the 16th, reconvene. Reconvene if the levy doesn't pass. This time, I'm interested in what the consensus of this body is now. You know, we'll speak to that.
I'd like to make a motion that we, the budget that's been presented tonight, 2023, 25 city budget. To approve by the budget committee and pass on to the city council.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the amended budget with the changes that were incorporated into it this evening to the city council for consideration. Maybe the outcome of the election for public safety levy. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay. Hearing none opposed, the motion is carried. Thank you. And that will conclude, we will adjourn the meeting of the budget committee at 7:28 p.m. And we convene in 2 minutes or 5, let's go reconvene in 5 minutes for the URA agency budget.